Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session titled Freedom to Pursue Excellent Teaching, Faculty Agency, and Open Educational Practices. My name is Mandy Goodset, and I am a librarian at Cleveland State University in the Michael Schwartz Library.
And I am, excuse me, I am Sean Burns, Associate Professor in the School of Information Science at the University of Kentucky. Next slide. Next slide, one more. There we go. Thanks. So open educational practices promise affordability, inclusion, and innovation. Yet we still see a gap between enthusiasm and adoption. So why do some faculty pursue OEP and broadly speaking, while others hold back? Well, part of the answer we are interested in lies in faculty agency. So faculty's ability to act on professional values despite the structural constraints. In other words, while the benefits of OEP are clear, the conditions that enable or suppress agency are not. So this study asks how those conditions shape whether faculty agency engage in OEP. Next slide. Thanks. Creating and adopting open educational resources depends on faculty willingness, ability, and agency to develop and use them. OEP is broader than OER. It can include open pedagogy, inclusive policies, and collaboration with students as co-creators. But OEP challenges old assumptions about authority and ownership in academia. There's still long-standing distrust of some forms of openness, especially open access publishing and OER, and these doubts combined with structural pressures make agencies central to whether OEP can take root. So we approach OEP as a matter not just of materials, of course, but also of faculty freedom. Next slide. Following Campbell and O'Meara's work, we define agency as the, quote, exertion of will toward achieving one's goals. And it emerges from three connected contexts. There's the individual context, and this includes things like psychological traits, internal resources, social capital, and identity. The organizational context, so this includes departmental climate, leadership, and policies, and societal kind of context, the broader norms and expectations, such as what counts as academic work. And we posit that this framework helps explain why OEP or slash OER adoption varies so widely. So agency is shaped as much by institutional culture and the social expectations as much as by individual intent. Next slide. Among tenure track faculty, the value of teaching versus research differs sharply by rank and institution. Expectations for research output have climbed for decades, while teaching and service remain undervalued. Even when excellent instruction is deemed necessary, it's still insufficient for advancement in many cases. These kinds of structural norms disadvantage women, minorities, and faculty doing teaching focused or pedagogical research. So even when tenure faculty want to engage in OEP, pursuing it can feel risky because it counts less towards tenure than traditional scholarship. Next slide. Meanwhile, roughly 70% of U.S. faculty are non-tenure track positions. These instructors do most of the teaching but have less job security, fewer resources, and minimal say in institutional decisions. And studies show that NTT faculty report lower career satisfaction and fairness and less belonging or respect from tenure track colleagues. This is true across a wide variety of domains. Those conditions limit their autonomy and therefore their agency to experiment with new approaches like OEP. In short, those who teach the most often and often have the most impact have the least freedom to innovate. Next slide. When institutions promote OEP, they often also rely on grants or stipends or release time, especially for tenure track faculty. But those supports aren't evenly distributed. Tenure track faculty might get, or tenured faculty might get a course release. Adjuncts are expected to do the open work on their own time. Agency depends on access to funding, technical help, and institutional validation. But OEP adoption is strongest where open work is recognized as legitimate scholarship and supported across ranks, not just among the privileged few. Next slide. This study then examines how faculty agency across individual, organizational, and societal levels influences engagement in OEP. Specifically, in this study, we focus on first-year writing and composition instructors. These faculty often have high teaching loads and make significant impact on their students. We also aim to identify ways institutions can better support instructors in pursuing open practices given the agency-related barriers that they face. Next slide. Building on Campbell and O'Meara's conception of agency, we treat it as the capacity to shape one's environment and career trajectory. Next slide. And then the next slide. At the individual level, it involves psychological traits such as purpose, motivation, and certain kinds of outcomes like satisfaction, productivity, retention, professional growth, and more. At the organizational level, it involves collective influence on policy and decision making. And at the societal level, it's shaped by larger economic and political forces, much of what we're seeing today that define what counts as valuable academic work. Understanding OEP through this kind of lens reveals not only who adopts open practices, but why some feel they cannot. Next slide. To explore these issues, we conducted 15 60-minute interviews with composition instructors nationwide. We did it through technology like this. Recruitment was initially purposive, but then became snowball based. Each interview explored experiences with OER and OEP, perceptions of institutional support, and feelings of autonomy or constraint. We analyzed these conversations, these transcripts, and they allowed us to trace how agency operates and where it's restricted across different ranks and institutional context. And we analyzed by theme based on the O'Meara and Campbell work in faculty agency. And now I'll hand it over to my collaborator.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into some of the highlights of what we found, and I can really only scratch the surface in this short time. On some of these slides also, we included some representative quotes, which I also don't have time to read, but I encourage you to check out the slides later. So at the individual level, so for each level, we're going to look at both influences and impacts of the participants having the agency to pursue open educational practices, or OEP. So at the individual level, the biggest influence was faculty status. The professional status of participants influenced everything from how risk averse they were. So non-tenure track were unsurprisingly more risk averse as compared to tenure track. How many professional development opportunities were available to them. So just as we saw in the lit review, tenure track had more professional development opportunities than non-tenure track, and their ability to focus on excellent teaching. And here, actually, non-tenure track participants had more agency. Although the influence of faculty status was complex, in general, adjuncts or contingent faculty had less freedom to pursue their professional goals, including OEP. Status also influenced workload, which is especially important for these first-year writing instructors who often had enormous teaching workloads in addition to other professional responsibilities. Without a lot of time, OEP could be out of reach for some. Finally, for some participants, aspects of their personality actually made their pursuit of OEP easier. Instructors who were unafraid to challenge authority or were really willing and eager to take on a lot of new projects, even if it kept them very busy, fared better in pursuing OEP. When it came to outcomes of successful OEP, many of the participants felt that OEP allowed them to pursue what they considered to be excellent teaching practices. So they were often those faculty who were already drawn to OEP were really excited in general about creative, innovative teaching approaches, and OEP allowed them to do what they loved, which is to prioritize authentic, student-driven pedagogy. Many of them also noted that their students expressed gratitude for a more engaging learning experience too. Participants also generally tended to care quite a bit about the quality of the course materials they were using. So OEP allowed them to be really picky and flexible in choosing the required course content that they thought was best. The interviewees did admit that OEP did almost always result in an increased workload, however. The time it took to assemble, vet, and/or write course materials from scratch was added on to an already heavy workload. Finally, participants were very passionate about promoting student well-being and the impact of educational costs. They empathize strongly with the tough position some of their students are in, taking on multiple jobs outside of school, maybe being a caregiver and being a student, or just generally trying to be frugal in the face of huge student debt. And they talked about that, and they talked about their own experiences going through that. as a student. OEP allowed them to promote student well-being in a tangible way that aligned with their values. So at the organizational level, the biggest influence on agency was credit and incentives for OEP work. This included the availability of formal credit, like being able to count this work towards promotion and tenure, and as well non-formal credit, like awards, opportunities to present at conferences or on campus, and being featured in campus marketing. Many participants particularly appreciated grants that paid them for the additional work and time needed to do OEP. Others, however, did not receive a lot of organizational credit, or they felt that the credit that they got was kind of more just lip service and it didn't really match the amount of work that was needed to successfully engage in OEP. And that was a considerable barrier to their agency. Leadership support of OEP was, unsurprisingly, important, as was support from the library. Many participants spoke very warmly about the library, some even saying that they were certain they could not have done their project without library support. And some of them talked about how they knit with librarians and how much they love them. Finally, when participants were in a supportive department or had colleagues within their field who could kind of introduce them to OEP and support them, that was a huge positive influence. At the organizational level, there were a couple of outcomes as well of successful OEP. One was that even if formal promotion and tenure guidelines rarely were actually changed, norms and expectations for what could count as teaching and service did sometimes change. Some of the participants were able to find a way to include OEP in their formal evaluations and successfully got credit for this work, which was kind of a new thing for their departments. There were a number of participants in the study who were leaders of their program or department, and when these folks had the ability to pursue OEP, it often led to more support for OEP across the entire department. However, for a couple of participants who were actually forced to use OEP by leadership, they felt that this actually diminished their agency, and they were not happy about that. Interestingly, when leaders have the agency to pursue OEP, but then they force it on others, it can ultimately limit faculty agency. At the societal level, one of the big influences on faculty agency and OEP was the current commercial textbook publishing context. Some felt that the prestige of commercial publishing put pressure on them to stop pursuing OEP, or it made some of their colleagues less welcoming of OEP in their department. And remember, a lot of these folks are in first-year writing programs that are within a larger English department. So you could really see the contrast between, English faculty and first-year writing faculty, first-year writing faculty in terms of what they thought was valuable textbook publishing. The political environment in the state of each of the participants also varied in its influence. Some states actually helpfully promoted OEP and provide resources, while participants in other states were worried about censorship in the OERs they produced due to state-level interference. To a lesser extent, COVID-19 and the rise of generative AI influenced faculty pursuit of OEP, but in complex ways. The pandemic actually made it a little easier to pursue OEP because of the push to calm classes and just make access easier for all the students who are homebound. Worries about generative AI, which were just ramping up when we did these interviews, often was basically another thing to worry about, taking time away from OEP work. That said, the instructors who experimented with open pedagogy and OEP seemed more prepared to change up their teaching in the face of generative AI. It was really difficult to determine societal impacts of OEP adoption, but some participants who successfully implemented OEP found themselves in these flourishing academic communities of other OER users and creators that were new to them. And they also noted that new voices were able to be present in the academic discourse thanks to OEP. Okay, so now for a few quick takeaways. So keeping in mind that OEP can benefit individual faculty, students, and institutions and our society, this seems like a worthwhile goal. So how can we make OEP more accessible to faculty who want to pursue it? Here are some ideas from what we learned in the study. One big takeaway is that faculty status has a huge impact. Administrators should do what they can to lower the workload for instructors who want to do OEP regardless of their status. In fact, adjuncts might need a break from their course load even more, given how huge their teaching workload is. Non-tenure track instructors should also be invited to participate in OEP professional development and sometimes explicitly invited. These folks are often left out of professional development opportunities, but this study shows how impactful they can be for instructors who are passionate about OEP. Although some participants did get formal recognition for their OEP work, others were not able to get formal credit or felt discouraged by their departmental culture. If leaders formally allow OEP to be part of the evaluation process, that would have eliminated some hurdles for folks in this study. Some participants complained about, like I said earlier, kind of lip service or pat on the back for the enormous amount of work that OEP requires, and that felt a little hollow to them. So they would have liked true acknowledgement of the time and the value that this work really brings. And that would really help for administrators to consider. For example, payment and course releases. Easier said than done, but that was a big takeaway. Participants were very enthusiastic about library support for their OEP work, and it really does seem like libraries are very well equipped to continue offering this support. So when possible, they should be allowed to do that, and they should be resourced to provide it. Some participants wouldn't have participated in OEP at all without a little push from a colleague within their department or discipline. And others were really excited to discover that by participating in OEP, they were joining this big welcoming community of educators. So institutions and state level organizations can encourage disciplinary faculty communities of practice or even mentoring relationships to provide that really important support. And finally, an interesting finding of the study, it's a little bit tangential, was just the fact that some of these participants who are already doing OEP found it easier to flexibly adapt to unforeseen challenges like a global pandemic or the shakeup caused in higher ed by generative AI. So support for OEP and other creative pedagogical approaches can have really great short-term benefits, but it also may allow for instructors who are already open to change and flexibility to implement that flexibility in a highly volatile educational context. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. We would love to hear how these takeaways resonate with your own context, and we would also love to hear your questions. And I think we have a solid 7 minutes for questions. Um, there's a question about downloading the slides. I will happily get a link for you all right now. Sample interview questions. I don't have them pulled up, but I will tell you this, we are hoping to publish this study, and when we do, we will publish all the interview questions as well. But we ask things like, um, we grouped all the questions by the different levels in the Campbell and O'Meara model. So we ask questions at the individual level, things about their personal experience and trying to exercise agency, questions about at the institutional level, like how did their institution help and support them in their pursuit, or how did it provide barriers for them? And then at the societal level as well. Question, did you get further context on how it made them feel more able to adapt to things like COVID? So it wasn't like a major theme. It didn't come up with everyone, but for those who were using open resources, they did find that it was like at the time, people really wanted to make things easier for students. They wanted them to have online access to materials. They didn't want to, have students messing around with costs of materials. So open educational resources were a really great option at that time. So people who had already adopted them had a smoother time navigating at least that part of the pandemic. While I wait for more questions, I'm going to get the link to the slide.
I don't know if that we can say anything about their psychology, but there was a strong sense of value in making an openness. So there seems to be like an initial, even like before the fact, before the evidence came in, that open educational practices, open educational resources have like material benefits to students and learners and instructors. There seems to be like an initial belief and value that these things are important and worth pursuing. And I think just based on other literature that I've read that it's not included in here, a lot of us who are instructors pursue this because of what we think are benefits to those things, you know, to students, to instruction, to education, and so on and so forth.
Yes, yeah. I think that's a great question. It's really hard to determine cause and effect. I did ask many of the participants, basically, like, if OEP didn't exist, would you still be trying to do innovative teaching? Which is a bit of a leading question, but all of them said yes. They all said, oh, yeah, of course, I would be trying to do creative and interesting things in the classroom. And I suspect it's that more so than OEP in particular, but just like this flexibility, this creativity, willing to try new things. That is really what gives them that resilience when new things come along. Is just that flexibility in general, is my sense.
I'm really curious at the societal level that we talked about. Like Mandy said, we conducted these interviews were conducted like as like Gen AI was rising. So we've done the interviews have been done for a little bit of time, not a whole year, but like about, and as we've done the analysis and so forth. But like recent things in the United States that I know we have some Canadians here in the United States have made this kind of interesting. Like for example, in Florida, there are some new rules being discussed or going into place. I just kind of saw the news recently about requiring syllabi to be made available publicly. And this, because of the context, has made some faculty nervous. But it's still like an open educational practice on paper. In spirit, it seems to be more about surveillance and maybe punishment. So it'd be interesting to redo this, kind of like do this project again, like today, given what's going on in the United States in the last 9 months, well, year.
I think that's a really great point because it's kind of like in the spaces where, oh, open using an OER is required. That even though we say, "Hooray, OERs are great," like, that really didn't feel good to the instructors. They wanted to be able to have that freedom. So I think in the same vein, like, we might say, "Oh, sharing your syllabus is really great," but when you're forced to do it, it feels a lot more like an attack. So, yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at, to do this again in today's environment. Any other questions? You have 1 or 2 minutes left. If not, our contact information is on the screen. We'd love to hear from you if you have questions that you think of later. And thanks everybody for attending. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.